The sea was quiet, too quiet. Rear Admiral Ellis Granger stood on the deck of the Ardent, a British reconnaissance cruiser, watching a low mist settle over the Atlantic horizon like a veil. His gloved hands rested on the cold rail, but his mind was burning. He had read the reports, so many of them contradictory, so many of them buried under bureaucratic nonsense. Something was happening beyond the rules, something big. For over a decade, the world had sworn off escalation. The treaties were clear. No super battleships, no unrestricted expansion, no naval monsters like the ones that had darkened the seas in 1916. Granger had signed his name to the treaty documents in Washington himself, back when he still believed that ink could hold back war. But now, strange sightings off the Japanese coast, intercepted blueprints from German couriers, and satellite photographs, blurry, smuggled out of a Soviet base in Murmansk, told a different story. Granger could feel it in his bones. The rules were being ignored, and the world, as always, was turning a blind eye. Across the globe, in a dimly lit office buried under layers of marble and propaganda in Berlin, Counter Admiral Emil Voss sipped bitter coffee and stared at the line drawings of the Scharnhorst. Officially, the ship was a heavy cruiser. Unofficially, it was a battleship in all but name. Voss had spent years refining its specs in secrecy, working around limitations like a criminal escaping through cracks in a cell wall. Every ton hidden, every gun labeled something it was not. The Reich didn't just want warships, they needed them. Power, after all, wasn't declared in speeches. It was enforced by steel. Voss wasn't a man drawn to ideals or patriotism. He didn't care for Hitler's ravings or the uniform stitched with too much brass. What drove him was precision, design, the beauty of machines engineered to dominate. He had watched the British float their treaty-compliant ships, clean, lean, unimpressive, and he had laughed. Weakness wrapped in paper promises. In Tokyo Bay, Vice Admiral Kazuo Himura stood at the edge of a secret dry dock, staring up at the still-forming hull Yamato. It was monstrous, even in the skeletal stage. Japan had left the treaty framework 3 months ago, but the real betrayal had begun years earlier. The ministry had lied, the Navy had complied, and Himura had ensured all stayed buried beneath layers of false tonnage reports and fake public plans. No one outside Japan would know what was coming until it was too late. To Himura, the decision wasn't rebellion. It was survival, surrounded by imperial powers, hemmed in by embargoes and watched constantly from American patrols. Japan had no room to play fair. The ocean was their lifeline, and only dominance could protect it. He had no illusions about peace. Peace was a pause, and Japan's pause had already cost him too much. Back in London, Granger paced a naval intelligence briefing room. The walls lined with sepia photos of admirals long dead and wars poorly remembered. He tossed another grainy image onto the table. A silhouette, a flash of hull, the barest outline of what could be a massive new ship. His colleagues murmured, some skeptical, others clearly shaken. The First Sea Lord leaned forward, fingers pressed together. "If this is accurate," he said, his voice quiet, "then the treaties are broken. They've been broken for years." Granger snapped, the words hot with frustration. "We just refuse to admit it." There was a long silence, the kind that settles like fog over graves. "Do we respond?" someone finally asked. Granger's mind flashed to his days in the negotiation halls, to the Americans and French and Japanese representatives all sitting in polished chairs under the illusion of global cooperation. The optimism then had been real, the desire genuine. But treaties, he had learned, were only as strong as the weakest ambition. And ambition, he now saw, was swelling everywhere. In Berlin, Voss signed off on the next phase of construction, his pen gliding over forge numbers with mechanical ease. He felt no guilt. The British had ruled the waves for centuries. Now it was someone else's turn. The world was never meant to be balanced. It was meant to be claimed. In Tokyo, Himura received the coded confirmation. The final armor plating was en route. He turned from the dock and stepped into the rain. He was building not just a ship, but a future carved into steel. And no paper in Geneva would stop him. The momentum was undeniable. In secret hangars and hidden ports, the greatest warships of the modern world were being assembled. each one a defiant middle finger to the treaties that had promised restraint. The world had spoken of peace, but prepared for war. Granger stood again on the deck of the Ardent, the ocean stretching before him like a question. The rules were broken. The others had built warships anyway. And now he wondered, what choice did he have? Rain slicked the hull of the Graf Spee as it glided out of Wilhelmshaven under moonlight, nearly invisible to prying eyes. Admiral Emil Voss stood motionless on the bridge, the hum of the engines pulsing beneath his feet like a heartbeat. The ship was quiet, but inside him a war had already begun. The Graf Spee was not a cruiser by any honest measure. Its guns, its armor, its range, everything about it mocked the treaty limits Germany had publicly accepted. Voss knew the lie by heart, because he'd built it word by word, bolt by bolt. A ship was never just steel. It was intention made physical, policy turned into something that could kill. And this ship was made to defy. In the harbor below, a handful of naval officials saluted as the Graf Spee disappeared into the mist. Voss didn't return the gesture. He wasn't interested in ceremony. Every moment the ship remained unseen was a victory. The Reich could not afford open defiance, at least not yet. But shadows? Shadows were safe. Shadows were fertile. 6,000 miles east, beneath the thick silence of a guarded shipyard near Kure, Vice Admiral Kazuo Himura stepped across a scaffold and looked up at the ribcage of the Yamato. It was massive beyond comprehension, dwarfing every battleship that had come before it. Himura's hand ran along the cold steel beam as if touching a living thing. She was not yet complete, but the idea of her was already alive. The Yamato was not being built in response to any one enemy. It was being built as a statement that Japan, small as it seemed on the world map, would not be contained. The whispers from the naval attaches had reached him. Britain growing nervous, America suspicious, the Soviets calculating. None of it mattered. The treaties had served their purpose. For others, Japan had grown strong in silence. Now it was time to speak in thunder. Himura descended the scaffolding and entered the engineering office, where Chief Designer Yamamoto waited with blueprints rolled under one arm. The two men exchanged no pleasantries. There was no need for masks between conspirators. She'll display 72,000 tons once fully outfitted. Yamamoto said quietly, as if the numbers themselves would betray them, more if we reinforce the belt armor. Do it, Himura said. They'll learn the truth eventually. By then, it won't matter. Elsewhere, in the cold Mediterranean wind, Admiral Lorenzo Beretti of the Italian Regia Marina stood on the deck of the Littorio. Sleek and elegant, the vessel shimmered under a Tuscan sun, like a predator just below the surface. Italy had signed the treaties too, grudgingly, but Mussolini had made his expectations clear. Respect was earned through presence, not signatures. And presence meant ships. Beretti traced the outline of the main turret with a gloved finger, admiring the understated aggression in its design. The Littorio would sail soon, joining her sister ships in an expanding fleet Mussolini hoped would dominate the southern seas. He didn't care much for the politics of it all. His love was for the craft, the tactics, the history written in salt and cannon smoke. But he knew ambition when he saw it. The Duce wanted a new Roman Empire, and empires needed navies. Still, there was something hollow in Beretti's chest, an unease he could not name. The British were watching. The French were uneasy. But it was the Germans who kept them up at night. Too quiet, too secretive. If Voss was behind the Graf Spee, then what else had he hidden? The game was no longer about who followed the rules. It was about who cheated best. Across the English Channel, Rear Admiral Ellis Granger watched the latest intelligence files arrive, his hands still smelling of the salt air. The photographs were clearer now, less grain, more detail. He recognized silhouettes. Unmistakable. The German hulls were getting larger. Japanese carriers were appearing where none had been reported. Italy's fleet was posturing farther west with each passing month. Granger dropped the reports on his desk and leaned back in his chair. The truth had crystallized, hard and cold. They were no longer bound by the same agreement. Britain was playing a game whose rules had already been rewritten in secret. And still, Whitehall hesitated. He stood and walked toward the window. London moved below in a steady rhythm, unaware that the balance of power was already tilting. He thought of Voss and Himura, men he had never met, but whose signatures were burned into the shape of the world to come. They were building futures. He was still holding on to ghosts. Later that week, in a private meeting with the First Sea Lord and key ministers, Granger laid it bare. They're building warships, he said. Real ones, not loophole cruisers. Battleships, carriers, everything the treaties were meant to prevent. The room was silent except for the shuffle of papers and the quiet breath of powerful men doubting their place in history. Are we certain? Yes, Granger replied. And if we wait much longer, we'll be watching them sail past over. The silence was broken only by a curt nod. The ministers didn't like it, but they understood. Treaties were paper. Warships were fact. In Berlin, the Graf Spee began trials in the North Sea. Voss watched her move like a wolf unchained. She cut through the waters with precision, her engines smooth, her guns ready. The deception had worked. The world still thought her a cruiser. Let them think it, he mused. Reality would catch up eventually. In Tokyo, the final rivets of the Yamato were set under the cover of night. Himura watched in the docks, rain rolling off his coat. He lit a cigarette and stared up at her hull. They'll call it madness, he thought, but they'll only call it that because we did it first. In London, Granger returned to his ship, orders in hand. New ones. They were building again, not in defiance, not yet, but in preparation. The rules had been broken. Others had built warships anyway. Now it was Britain's turn. The ice cracked under the weight of steel as the Soviet ship Savitsky-Soyuz broke through the frozen White Sea, her bow shimmering with frost and secrecy. Commander Viktor Semyonovich stood wrapped in a thick wool coat, expression flat as the wind howled past him. He did not smile. There was no triumph in unveiling a vessel the world wasn't meant to see, just inevitability. He pulled a flask from his coat, took a single sip of bitter vodka, and stared out at the crew scrambling to unfurl the last of the red banners across the upper deck. The ship was not finished, not really, but it existed, and that, in this silent war of illusions, was enough. Moscow had never been party to the naval treaties. While the West debated tonnage and ethics, Stalin had issued a simpler command: build. Faster, larger, deadlier. The Soviets didn't need loopholes. They needed reach. And if Victor had any doubts about the path ahead, he buried them with the rest of his conscience years ago. Far west, in a coated chamber deep beneath the Admiralty, Rear Admiral Granger stood hunched over a wall-sized map. Pins marked enemy movement, sightings, rumors. The tension in the room was tactile, as if the very walls knew war was drawing closer. Granger's hand hovered above a marked point near keel. They've launched the Bismarck, a young officer said, voice taut. Granger didn't respond at first. He simply pressed the pin deeper into the map. The name echoed in his mind, Bismarck, as heavy and symbolic as any dreadnought from the last war. Not a cruiser, not even a treaty-compliant battleship. This was declaration by steel. How did we let it come to this? Someone muttered. We didn't let anything, Granger said coldly. They took. We hoped. Hope had been the enemy all along. In Tokyo, Vice Admiral Himura received a decrypted message from Pearl Harbor. American interest was shifting. Their Pacific fleet was growing, bracing. The signal was clear. Suspicion had bloomed into preparation. He crushed the paper in his fist and tossed it into the ashtray. The Yamato was nearly complete. Her full displacement was no longer a number they dared hide. The Americans would learn eventually. When they did, the Admiralty hoped it would be too late to matter. Himura met that timeline with a grim resolve. Japan could not match the U.S. ship for ship, but one devastating strike, he believed, could cripple morale and force negotiations. Not victory, position. It's always the first blow, he told his staff. That determines who dictates the terms. In Berlin, Admiral Voss received photographs of the British King George V-class battleships. Their guns were smaller, their armor thinner, but they were real and coming fast. Britain had clearly abandoned any pretense of treaty purity. He lit a cigar and leaned back, letting the smoke twist upward like a dying promise. Every admiral now knew the game had changed. No more caution, No more negotiation. It was speed, deception, and firepower. And in that arena, Voss believed the Kriegsmarine had done more with less than anyone else. Still, the numbers disturbed him. Britain and France combined could outbuild them. The Americans, if provoked, could dwarf them. Germany had defied the limits. But defiance did not equal advantage. His thoughts drifted to Granger, though they had never met. He imagined the Englishman in some dark office, surrounded by maps and regrets, wondering when the clock had run out. Voss almost pitied him. In London, Granger reviewed a transcript of intercepted German radio chatter. The pieces were aligning. The Bismarck was more than a ship. It was a symbol, a test of Britain's will. And symbols demanded response. War was not yet declared, but everyone was preparing for it. In Parliament, voices clashed, some demanding restraint, others calling for mobilization. Granger said nothing. He simply handed them what they feared most. Facts, tonnage numbers, gun calibers, flight deck lengths, real things. We either catch up, he told the Prime Minister privately, or we drown. The sea, once a shield for the island nation, now felt like a door left open. In the Mediterranean, Admiral Baretti watched as British ships sailed uncomfortably close to Italian waters. The tension was electric. Every maneuver, every turn of a turret, was a question without words. Will you? Would you dare? He thought of Mussolini's speeches, thick with pride and promise. But he also knew his fleet was not invincible. Italian ships were fast, beautifully designed, but vulnerable. And if the British came in force, it wouldn't matter how elegant the littorio looked cutting through a sunset. In a private memo to Rome, Baretti wrote, "The treaties are dead. Everyone is rearming. We stand proud but alone." And alone, he feared, was a death sentence. In Washington, the U.S. Navy began expanding in earnest. Neutrality, once sacred, was eroding under the weight of foreign escalation. The president didn't speak of war, but his signature quietly authorized billions in shipbuilding funds. Across all oceans, shipyards bloomed like hives. Sparks flew, rivets were driven home, and keels were laid with a kind of sacred urgency. The treaties were buried beneath steel. Commander Semyonovich aboard the Savitsky Soyuz ran a hand along the inner bulkhead, listening to the hull groan under its own ambition. He thought of the Arctic ice that surrounded them, of the men working below who believed in the dream of a Soviet oceanic fleet. The Americans had oceans, the British had colonies, but now Russia had firepower. He looked out at the snow beyond the shipyard walls and saw only opportunity. And yet, every admiral, Voss, Himura, Baretti, Granger, even Semyonovich, understood what was coming. No fleet could hide forever. No battleship, however advanced, could avoid destiny. The treaties had not prevented war. They had delayed it. War, they realized now, had been building not in chambers of diplomacy, but in the dry heat of welding torches and under the soundless watch of night patrols. When Granger next returned to the Ardent, he walked its deck in silence. The new guns had been installed. Upgrades were moving faster now. He touched the cold surface of a turret, then turned toward the bridge. "You think it's coming?" his XO asked. Granger didn't answer immediately. He stared out to sea, the gray horizon curling like smoke. "It's already here," he said quietly. "They just haven't fired yet." And as the sun set behind the steel skeleton of the future, the world waited for a spark. A low fog clung to the Atlantic like a living thing, wrapping itself around the steel flanks of the Bismarck as it moved westward. Slow and sovereign, Admiral Emil Voss stood on the command deck, arms crossed behind his back, the vibration of the ship's turbines pulsing through his boots. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life, though he hoped he would never see it. This was no longer posturing. The veil had been lifted. Britain had spotted them. Contact was inevitable. The tension in the control room was brittle. Every officer knew what the Bismarck represented: pride, defiance, a wager with history. If they failed now, they would not just lose a ship. They would lose the illusion that Germany's fleet was untouchable. A young signals officer stepped forward, intercepted British transmission. "Sir, HMS Hood is moving to intercept." Voss didn't flinch. "Let them." Back in London, Rear Admiral Granger leaned over a plotting table, watching the chessboard shift in real time. The Hood, Britain's Lion, was now en route to intercept the Bismarck. It wasn't just a tactical maneuver, it was an answer. A challenge returned. He rubbed at his eyes. Sleep was a luxury no longer afforded to men in his position. The pieces had moved too far to stop now. He could feel the pulse of it, history accelerating. One mistake at sea could ignite an inferno. In Tokyo, Vice Admiral Himura stood before a projection of the Pacific Ocean. His fingers tapped lightly on the islands laid out before him like stepping stones across deep water. Pearl Harbor blinked on the screen, the heartbeat of American naval power in the Pacific. The Yamato was now officially complete, but there was no ceremony, only silence. The Japanese fleet was ready, not for open conflict yet, but for a strike that would define the tempo of everything that followed. "Do we wait for them to move first?" his aide asked. "No," Himura replied. "We let them think they're safe. Then we teach them what it costs to ignore the East." In the Mediterranean, Admiral Baretti stood at the helm of the Vittorio Veneto, watching as Allied aircraft shadowed them from beyond the horizon. No fire had been exchanged, but the lines had already been drawn. Skirmishes had erupted near Malta. The sea had become a chessboard of nerves. He took a breath, deep and tired. Italy had played both sides too long, walking a line between German confidence and Allied caution. That line was beginning to tear. And Baretti knew, perhaps better than Mussolini, that once war truly erupted, the Mediterranean would become a graveyard for the unprepared. He clutched the rail as wind tore across the bow. Somewhere in the spray, he thought he heard the ghost of Trafalgar. In the Arctic North, Commander Semyonovich watched the Savitsky Soyuz take its first full-speed trial run. The ship cut through the ice like prophecy. Moscow had been quiet of late, but the directive remained clear. Prepare for opportunistic engagement. Let the capitalist powers tire each other out. He had no illusions about the Soviets' intentions. Stalin viewed every movement as leverage. If war came, Russia would not enter to save the world. It would enter to reshape it. Still, part of Semyonovich was proud. The ship was real. The doctrine was brutal, but the engineering was purer. The British fleet met the Bismarck at dawn. Fog lifted as if peeled away by divine hand. The Hood, accompanied by HMS Prince of Wales, closed the distance quickly. On board the Hood, Captain Holland stared through his binoculars as the silhouette of the German monster emerged from the morning haze. He had seen battle before. This was different. This wasn't a fleet engagement. This was symbolic retribution. "Open fire," he ordered. The sea erupted. Shells screamed across the water, metal chasing metal in a ritual of annihilation. The Bismarck responded in kind, its main guns thundering with primal force. One salvo, perfectly aligned, struck the Hood midship. For a heartbeat, the British flagship continued forward. Then an explosion. Fire. A column of smoke. Silence. From the deck of the Bismarck, Voss watched the legendary British battlecruiser vanish beneath the sea in a matter of minutes. No cheer rose. There was only the eerie quiet of sudden victory. He turned to his second-in-command. "Now they will come." And they did. In London, word of the Hood's sinking hit the War Cabinet like a detonation. Granger's face went pale. There were no speeches, no rage, just grim understanding. "This is it," he said. That night, orders were issued. All available ships in the North Atlantic were to hunt the Bismarck. Every gun, every hull, every man. In Washington, news of the battle came with eerie calm. The Americans hadn't entered the war officially, but their carriers were already shifting position. Pearl Harbor grew restless. President Roosevelt had seen enough. The war had become too large to ignore. In Tokyo, Himura received the intelligence with quiet approval. With the Hood gone and the Atlantic aflame, American attention would be split. If there was ever a time to strike Pearl Harbor, it was now. The decision had not yet been finalized, but the plans had already been drawn in ink. "Timing is everything," he whispered. At Scapa Flow, Granger stood aboard the King George V, now designated the flagship for the task force pursuing the Bismarck. His jaw clenched with resolve. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about reclaiming control of the narrative. The Bismarck had become a symbol. If it escaped, it would redefine naval power. But if they sank her, the message would be just as clear. Britain still ruled the seas. Send the signal. Granger ordered, no retreat. We finished this. In the final hours of the chase, the British fleet cornered the Bismarck, damaged from a torpedo strike. She could no longer maneuver. The storm above raged, but it didn't matter. The line had been drawn in steel and fire. As the shells fell, Voss stood tall on the shattered bridge. His face was bloodied, uniform torn, but his gaze never wavered. He watched the British shell strike home, each one peeling back layers of hull and history. He did not give the order to abandon ship. He had broken the rules, built a ship the world said should not exist. And now he would go down with it. The Bismarck sank slowly into the Atlantic, smoke trailing behind her like a dying scream. In London, Granger received a report with a heavy heart. The Bismarck was gone, the hood avenged, but he felt no triumph. Only the chill of knowing this was just the beginning. The treaties were ash. The world was now ruled by what could be built, and who dared to use it first. Back in Tokyo, Himura watched the sunrise over the harbor, the silhouette of the Yamato casting long shadows across the waves. He sipped his tea slowly, then turned to his staff. It's time. And in the silence that followed, the world held its breath.